Hi everyone and welcome to the Arkham Seeker. Today in this video I'm going to teach you how to build decks for the Fed Roland Banks. First, this video is going to inaugurate a channel that is broader from another channel, which is made in Spanish language. This channel will be a space where I'll be talking about Arkham Horror, the card game, in English language. However, beware that English is not my native language and I'm still studying it and trying to be more fluent. In fact, that's one of the main motivations behind this channel. So, after that clarification, let's start with this first video, where I'll teach you how to build good decks for one of the most popular characters in Arkham Horror, the card game, which is Roland Banks, the first investigator included in the game's core set. This video will follow the same structure as my other deck building guides in Spanish. Firstly, I'll explain the basic characteristics of Roland Banks, for which I'll carefully read his investigator card and his signature cards, and I'll make a basic analysis of his strengths and weaknesses, which are critical to understand how to build good decks for him. Once we know Roland well as an investigator, I'll discuss the basic strategy for building his decks, and I'll do it by indicating which cards can be used by Roland to achieve the most important aspects of the game, like finding clues, dealing with enemies, and defending himself. Finally, I'll take you to the Arkham DB webpage and show you different example decks for Roland, both made by me and by other content creators. So, without further ado, let's start by explaining the main characteristics of Roland Banks. Roland Banks, the Fed, is a Guardian class investigator with 3 willpower, 3 intellect, 4 combat, and 2 agility. He has a reaction ability that can be triggered whenever you defeat an enemy, and lets you automatically discover 1 clue at his location, limited to once per round. The Elder Sign for him is a +1 for each clue on his location. He has 9 health and 5 sanity. His deck size is 30 and can include cards of Guardian class level 0 to 5, Seeker 0 to 2, and Neutral 0 to 5. Additionally, he must include his 38 special, Cover Up, and the random basic weakness. His signature card is Roland's 38 Special, a 3-cost asset with combat, agility, and wild icons. It's an item, weapon, firearm, occupies 1 hand, enters with 4 ammo, and lets you spend 1 action and 1 ammo to fight. You'll get +1 combat for this attack or +3 instead if there's at least 1 clue at his location. In any case, this attack will deal 1 extra damage. On the other hand, his personal weakness is Cover Up, a treachery, a task that, when revealed, must be placed on his threat area with 3 clues on it. It has a reaction ability that can be triggered whenever any number of clues on his location will be discovered, and lets us discard that many clues from this card instead. And remember that any investigator on Roland's location can trigger this ability, not only Roland. When any investigator at Roland's location would discover clues, they can trigger Cover Up's reaction and remove that many clues from that card instead. It also has a forced ability. When the game ends or when Roland is eliminated, if there are any clues on this card, Roland will suffer 1 mental trauma. Okay, firstly, which are the main strengths of Roland? Up front, he's a solid fighting character, as he has good combat ability and full access to Guardian class, which is a class that offers many weapons and tools to fight and defeat enemies. Besides that, Roland can get an additional benefit from defeating enemies, which is discovering a clue for free at his location. This is a quite powerful ability that is stronger the fewer players are in the game, as the value of a single clue is bigger the fewer investigators are in the game. Secondly, Roland can discover clues with relative ease, both by using his reaction ability or by using Seeker cards, which is a class that offers many ways to discover clues, either by investigating or by discovering them directly, without skill tests. Finally, I think that Roland's signature card is quite powerful, as it is another tool to fight enemies with an unconditional extra damage and the option of having a huge skill boost. if his location has clues on it, which for Roland is always desirable in order to potentially trigger his reaction ability. That sums up the main strengths of Roland as an investigator. So what are his main weak points? The most important is that his sanity is very low and also comes with a pretty nasty personal weakness that threatens with mental trauma if the team cannot discover extra clues. Also, Roland's weakness has a pretty high variance, because depending on when it's drawn, it's possible that the clues cannot be discovered in a realistic way, and that mental trauma can really hurt Roland, especially if he accumulates more than one mental trauma. Finally, despite the fact that I think that Roland is a very good investigator, he's been a bit outshined by future Guardians, who can fight and defeat enemies more easily than Roland. However, I still think that Roland is a strong choice for a fighting investigator if you don't have a complete collection of the game's different expansions. In general, I consider Roland a low to very low complexity investigator. He's very easy to set up and play, and that's the reason the game suggests the players use Roland as their first investigator when they are playing the game for the first time. He's an average clue getter. Although he can discover clues with relative ease, he's not able to do it at the same rate as the best seekers. Obviously, he's a strong fighter, but not as good evading enemies. His physical defense is high thanks to the Guardian class and high health, and his mental defense is quite poor due to his low sanity and the threat of his personal weakness. I think that this analysis has covered the main characteristics of Roland Banks as an investigator. Now we know which are his main strengths and weaknesses, and we have the key information to be able to build good decks for him. So now we are going to study the deck building strategies for Roland in a deeper way, analyzing how Roland can achieve the basic tasks that are needed to consistently win the game, which are the ones that you are seeing now on the screen. We'll go one by one, exposing how Roland can be good at each of these categories, using example cards. Let's start with clue gathering. Which cards can help Roland to find clues? Given that Roland has an average intellect, the best bet for him is to use effects that can directly discover clues without investigating or taking skill tests. His reaction ability is a good example by default, and he can combine it with the evidence card, which grants him an additional clue if he defeats an enemy at a location with clues. Another option is to use the working a hunch card, which also grants Roland a direct clue without spending an action. In this case, he will have to spend the card and 2 resources, which is a fair price for an investigator without good clue gathering skills. Even though Roland's intellect isn't good, it isn't bad either, so it's enough to investigate low shroud locations or to use tools like the flashlight to reach medium shroud locations. Finally, Roland has access to Seeker cards, so he can take the Deduction, one of the best clue-gathering cards in the game. Although he can't get the best from it, as it still needs a good base intellect to investigate safely, it's still a viable option if you want Roland to gather more clues. Let's jump into the enemy management area. Which cards can be used by Roland to deal with enemies? First, his signature card is good enough to deal with most enemies, in particular if you can use it in locations that have clues. A +3 combat boost can put Roland with an ability of at least 7, which is a good value for fighting most enemies in standard difficulty. Then he should be using one of the most basic cards for fighting characters, which is the Vicious Blow, a skill card that can grant us an extra damage on any combat attack, which is great for action compression. The fewer actions it takes you to defeat an enemy, the more action efficient you are and the less you depend on the Chaos Bag. In the most likely case that Roland doesn't see his signature card early in the game, he should be using other weapons. Thankfully, the core set includes a couple good weapons in Guardian class, as the 45 automatic and the machete. They are not as good as his signature card, but good enough to deal with most enemies. Any weapon that can deal extra damage is good enough for Roland, as his combat ability can still be boosted otherwise, with static boosts and or skill cards. Finally, the core set also includes a couple more ways of dealing damage to enemies in the form of allies. In particular, the guard dog and the level 2 beat cop are good ways of dealing additional damage to enemies. In particular, the upgraded beat cop is still a staple in many Guardian decks after many years and many expansions released, so it's an excellent card that Roland can use to both boost his combat ability and to deal action-less damage to enemies. Now we are going to look at the defensive area. Which cards can help Roland to defend himself from the mythos? First, he can use the dodge card to cancel enemy attacks. While you never want enemies attacking you, as it's better to defeat them before the enemy phase, this card can be a lifesaver in a couple common situations, such as a nasty retaliate from an enemy, like the Ghoul Priest, so it's a good card for defending Roland, in particular against horror attacks. Then you can boost Roland's willpower with the Guts card. Roland's willpower is average, and with a small boost like this, he can face basic willpower tests without much fear, such as Rotting Remains and Frozen in Fear. Another option is to use the First Aid card to heal damage and horror. I generally dislike this card, as it's too slow and inefficient in terms of actions, but it's still viable in a few decks, in particular if you are worried about Roland's sanity. However, you will find better alternatives in expansions. Finally, the best option you can find to defend Roland within the core set is the Elder Sign Amulet, a simple 4 horror soak that almost doubles Roland's sanity. Yes, it's a bit expensive in terms of experience points, but it's a safe bet to defend Roland's weakest point. Let's finish with the area I denominate synergies, where I usually mention several cards that have a good synergy with the character and that I have not included in the 3 previous categories. However, if we limit ourselves to the core set cards, I can't find any cards that fit under this area that were not mentioned already. The only good synergy you can find is the use of cards that help to defeat enemies and trigger Roland's ability more frequently. For this reason, here I'll make a small exception to my non-written rule of showing only cards that were published by the time that the Investigator was released, what is called progression mode. So I'll mention a couple cards from the first expansions that have good synergy with Roland. For example, we have the Art Student from the Dunwich expansion, a 2-cost ally that has a 2 horror soak and a reaction ability that grants Roland a free clue. She's a cheap and efficient way of both protecting Roland's weakest point and accelerating his clue gathering job. Then we have the Scene of the Crime from the Forgotten Age expansion, a 2-cost event that can give Roland 2 clues if he plays it as his first action of the turn and there's an enemy on his location. All this without triggering attacks of opportunity. Another good way of multiplying the number of clues that Roland can get in a single turn. If he can defeat the enemy with his remaining 2 actions, he can discover at least 3 clues on a single turn, which is a great number, on par with the specialist clue gathering characters. Finally, we have the Logical Reasoning from the Carcosa expansion, a 2-cost event that can heal 2 horror or discard a terror card from a threat area, such as Frozen in Fear. A good way of defending Roland by efficiently healing horror or taking away a dangerous terror card. This concludes the first part of the video. As I always say in Spanish, I hope I have managed to highlight the keys for building good decks for Roland. And now I'm going to show you a couple example decks. Let's go to the Arkham DB webpage where I'll show you different example decks for Roland. Okay, here we are at the ArkhamDB webpage, ready for the second part of the video. Here I'll show you a couple example decks for Roland. In this case, it will be one deck made by me and 3 made by other content creators. Let's start with my personal example deck, which you can find in this video's description, along with the other 3 deck lists. This deck tries to resemble a typical Roland deck, which can be built using a single revised core set. We want to make sure that Roland can fight and defeat enemies as fast as easily as possible. There are 5 weapon cards, which are critical to our strategy. Roland's 38 Special, the 45 Automatic, and the Machete. We must see at least one of these cards in our opening hand, although we can also keep the Guard Dog and the Vicious Blow if we want to be safe. We want to ditch everything that is not a weapon or any damage-dealing card, okay? Then the rest of the deck tries to support this core idea of fighting as fast and efficiently as possible. There are several secondary aspects that are also important for our strategy. First is the economy. We need to generate resources to pay for the previous cards, as some of them are quite expensive. For this reason, the emergency card is a very important card, as it allows us to pay for an expensive card. Then we must cover Roland's weakest point, which is mental defense. Cards like physical training or guts can boost his willpower, which is important to pass treachery tests such as Rotting Remains or Frozen in Fear. Also, the dodge card can cancel an enemy attack, which is good if it's a horror attack. However, the best defense for Roland's sanity will be the Elder Sign Amulet, which should be bought as an upgrade early in the campaign. Finally, I have included a couple more ways of gathering clues, which are evidence and working a hunch, in order to help our clue-gathering teammates along Roland's reaction ability. I remind you that this deck list can be found in this video's description. It contains an explanation text at the right of the screen and an upgrade plan, which is not intended for any campaign in particular. It's just a possible upgrade route that highlights the key cards that should be upgraded and their priority. Now I also want to show you several other decks for Roland, made by other content creators. I don't want to sell my personal deck as the best solution for Roland. First, because it's surely not. Second, because I think that there isn't a perfect deck for any character, as there are many variables as player count, who are your teammates, which campaign you are playing, that influence how optimal a deck can be. And third, because I think that showing other decks can highlight some other cards and combos that I have not covered in this video. That's because I may not like these cards or combos, or because I don't usually make them in my decks. The first deck I'm going to show you is Roland's example of the structured deck series, which is a compilation of different example decks using progression mode, and I think that they are good examples overall. Here I'm going to comment the key differences between my proposal and this example deck, as which cards are in this deck and not in mine. For example, this deck uses the knife as an additional weapon. It can be a good card if you only have a core set, as it can attack for an extra damage, which is always nice, but it only has one single use. It's cheap, but certainly not the best weapon. But if you see that my deck is lacking weapons, my advice would be to include a couple knives as a reinforcement. Actually, that's one of the few differences between this deck and mine. The events are almost the same, although only one copy of the Dynamite Blast is used, and I can see why, as it's expensive and hard to play, although it can be brutal on certain situations. The only other card that is present in this deck and not in mine is the Deduction. I mentioned this card in the first part of the video as a possible clue gathering card for Roland. So if you want him to be better at finding clues, it's always a great card to have. Then we have this deck, named a Skill Detective, where the main difference is the use of the magnifying glass as a hand asset. I don't think that Roland can get the best of this card, as his intellect is mediocre, but if you want him to become a better clue getter, it's not a bad option. However, beware that this card occupies one hand, and this limits Roland's ability of carrying weapons, which are critical for his strategy. Also, this deck includes a lot of skill cards, which I think is a good option if you only have a single core set, if you don't have expansions. It's better to have to include more skill cards, which can always be useful, instead of assets and events that are bad or average. However, this deck also includes a copy of First Aid, which is a mediocre healing card. For example, I would have run a second guard dog instead of that card, but it's not totally unplayable, of course, although I think it's better at high player counts. Finally, here's the deck made by the legendary Start With The Name, who is the most prolific deck creator at this page and has the best ratings among the community. His proposal isn't quite different to mine, as the main difference is that he's not including the Dynamite Blast, as it's a quite expensive card, and he's running the knives instead. As I said before, if you see that my deck is lacking on weapons and offense, the best option will be this: remove the Dynamite Blast and replace it with the knives. Then he's also using one copy of First Aid instead of, for example, a second physical training. But here I know why he's doing it. It's because this deck is part of a series of 5 decks, one for each investigator in the core set, that can be built all 5 at the same time using 2 old core sets or one single revised core set. So he must share all the card pool between all the investigators, and he's reserving one copy of each for the rogue investigator, Schizo Tool. Finally, he's opting to replace one of the unexpected courage with a manual dexterity. I probably would have left both copies of the courage in Roland and moved both dexterities to Skids or Wendy, as their agility is higher and they can get a bigger benefit of the card, at least bigger than Roland. But in general, I think that all 4 deck proposals are quite similar, and I just wanted you to see the small differences and how different deck creators can have different ideas. None of us have made the perfect deck. As I said before, as many factors can influence how optimal a deck is, but I think that all of them are good examples of typical Roland decks. So that's all for today. I hope I've managed to express myself well and that you have learned at least a bit from this video. And if I keep up with these videos, I'll be doing more deck building guides for more investigators of the game. So thanks for watching, in particular if you've seen the entire video, and I'll see you in future videos. Till we meet again here at the Arkham Seeker.